And welcome back. Now, the National Prosecuting Authority and the Directorate for Priority Crimes Investigation, the DPCI, have issued a joint statement saying that they are systematically reviewing the findings and recommendations of the state capture report. Now, the NPA says it has taken note of the Commission's findings that it failed to respond adequately to state capture. The two law enforcement agencies are committing themselves to investigate and prosecute criminal cases while pledging to insulate themselves from any perceptions of external influence. Right to Know campaign's founding member and political analyst, Dr Dale McKinley, joins us now virtually for a discussion on this. Dr McKinley, thanks so much for being with us. Good morning.
Good morning, Sakina, and good morning to all the viewers as well.
So interesting and not unexpected, though, as everybody has now, I would imagine, had time to apply themselves to the first part of the release of the state capture report. What is Right to Know's view on the statement released by the NPA and the DPCI?
Well, I think first of all, it's not surprising. It's clear that the nature of the Zonda report and the amount of information and the possibilities of numerous prosecutions is a great deal. It's overwhelming almost, I think, for the NPA and the DPCI. So I think their statement is basically setting the expectations for the nation and saying, look, we're going to try to do our best. We're a little bit hobbled. We're overwhelmed already by the caseload, so we're going to try to do our best, but just understand that we're under great pressure, that our capacity is limited. So I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to basically set the frame and say, we're dedicated to this, we're going to take it seriously, but don't expect to just in like 2 or 3 months that there's going to be a slew of cases and prosecutions. You're going to have to be patient about this. So I think it's a smart tactical move on their part in order to do that. But it's also a confirmation of what many of us and what many people have been saying for a long time, which is that the impact of state capture on the NPA and the DPCI itself has been quite substantial. So it's going to be a long road to get to the end of this Zonda report. And our expectations are quite substantial, and that's important for them to set those expectations.
So, Dr. McKinley, if the NPA has to date failed to respond adequately to some of these allegations that have been in the public domain for quite some time, what's going to change now? And is it good enough for the NPA in this stage of the game to say, you know what, we'll do our best?
Well, look, I mean, I think we can be, critical, and rightfully so, of some of the slow nature, as you say, of what the NPA hasn't done in the last couple of years. But I think in some ways, I feel a little bit of pity for them because, and particularly Shamila Batory, she was thrown into the lion's den, and we all had these high expectations that we're going to see a mass of these prosecutions. And now we're seeing that it's a little bit more difficult than that. So more could be done. It needs to be better. They need to up their game. That's all for sure. But these are the institutions we have. And so I think we need to support them, and we need to say, okay, well, what can be done? What resources are needed? What more is needed? Instead of saying you haven't done a good job and you've been slow, let's say, what can we do to speed this up? What can we do to recapacitate the NPA and DPCI? And let's move together on this. And I think that is, as opposed to playing politics all the time with these things, which of course have become political footballs in the context of upcoming elections, the factional battles within the ANC, just what you were talking about with Lindiwe Sisulu's comments around the judiciary.
So just to that point, in terms of what has been done in the last few years in order to capacitate these institutions, in order to try and rebuild the institutional capacity, let's talk about that for a moment and what has been done and what still needs to be done.
Well, I think, first of all, just getting the personnel in. We have a range of people in the NPA and the DPCI who have clouds hanging over their heads, who are themselves involved in state capture. There's a lot of internal shuffling and shifting around and disciplinary procedures and all sorts of other things that we don't see as the public. We can't see into that internal sort of architecture. So I think that's the one aspect that has obviously slowed them down. But I think the sense is that it's slowly coming. The other thing, of course, is the resources. The NPA and DPCI, and particularly the NPA, have had their budgets cut. in the middle of a situation where we needed the exact opposite. We needed to have a whole range, more personnel and more resources. They've been pulled back. And that's not their fault necessarily, and certainly not Shamila Batoy's fault. But it's an issue where the public says, why? Why would you undermine resource-wise the very institutions that we want to take forward these prosecutions? So the resource question has to be addressed as well. And finally, there's got to be, I think, and Shamila Batoy has shown this, but let's see if the proof is in the sort of making of the pudding, which is the political will to act, is to go after the big fish, to go after the ones that, as the public, we think should be held responsible, and that remains to be seen. So I think we're going to have a sort of cocktail of expectations here that some are going to be met. I think a lot of them were going to be disappointed, but in many ways, I think this is what we have to accept has been the, should we say, the product of 7 to 8 years of absolute destruction of the capacity of these institutions in the state. And we're only beginning to realize that the NPA was in some ways destroyed much in the same ways ESCOM was.
And, you know, talking about the public and the public's expectations, and of course, a lot being said, especially of late, about the rule of law, as it were, Dr. McKinley. The statement also goes on to say that the Commission's recommendations will allow for the strengthening of the rule of law in South Africa in order to ensure that no one, irrespective of power, position, or wealth, is above the law, and also says that South Africans deserve nothing less. But again, doesn't that sound rather rhetorical, given that South Africans have been waiting for the strengthening as well of the rule of law from these institutions and others, and would say at this point, well, we don't need statements. At this point, we want to see action.
I think that's a legitimate expectation. Yes, we're all very, very impatient, and I think rightfully so. But I think we have to give this, we all waited so long for the Zondo report as well. I mean, the Zondo Commission's been going on for a long, long period of time. And all of a sudden now we have the final product. We can see what the recommendations are. We can look, even though many of us have said, well, we know that those people, we think they probably need to answer, have a case to answer. But in the context of the NPA, I think our approach should be one to say, yes, let's push critically. Let's continue to light the fire under the NPA and the DPCI and the political appointees. But let's support the process. If we continue simply to snipe from the sidelines, if we continue to sort of just say, you haven't done a good enough job, this is wrong, this is bad, then I don't think we're also giving them an opportunity, and particularly, I think, Shamila Batoy, who finds herself in a very difficult situation. So let's be critical, no problem. Let's push, no problem. But let's also support, and we're trying to reclaim as a country lost ground, legal ground, moral ground, institutional ground, and that's going to take a long time. It takes a very short time to destroy these things. It takes much, much longer to rebuild them.
And that is absolutely true. However, Dr. McKinley, then you should not have leaders coming on, standing on soapboxes and telling the public, making promises of things that will happen that ultimately don't happen. If you look at, the public's expectations and what has happened thus far, should the public still believe what is being said, even through statements now, considering that there have been opportunities, countless opportunities. They've been there even before the so-called 9 wasted years, before the state capture years, for these institutions to demonstrate their capability to enforce the law. To what extent, though?
Listen, Sakina, I'm in agreement with you. I mean, where there's a right to know in many civil society organizations, we've been pointing out for years and years and years these failures, these weaknesses within state institutions, the hypocrisy, the contradictions of the politicians, as you say, making all sorts of promises. You're absolutely correct. But we are in the situation we're in. We cannot redial back history and say, well, we should have done. Yes, we should have. And in fact, that's important to point out. But here we are. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, so what can we do as concerned citizens, as activists, as journalists, as media, to try to push that in the direction we'd like to go? Let's continue to point out the failures. Let's continue to be critical. Let's continue to say we need 1, 2, 3, and 4 done. But let's also, I think, say, let's give the opportunity to the NPA and DPCI now that the Zondo Commission report is out. They have no more excuses. There's no more time left to make those kinds of promises. If 6 months down the road we find ourselves in a similar situation, then I would say, yes, we can probably say, look, this has gone way too far. We have no more belief. And that's going to be a dangerous situation, not just in respect of not holding people accountable, but as you say, for our belief and our trust in our institutions and our democracy. So this is a fundamentally important point in our history, which is to say, can these institutions now, despite their failures, despite the gaps, can they begin to deliver at least partially and meaningfully on their mandates? And I think I would hope so, but there's no guarantee. And this is where we are, and we should follow that path.
And Dr. McKinley, part of that statement, when it gets into somewhat more technical matters, where the statement cautions the public to note the differences between the evidence presented before the Commission of Inquiry and evidence required to actually meet the standards of proof for prosecutions. I think that's important as well. Now, in terms of, again, allaying the fears of the public that this is another exercise in futility, is this a legitimate and valid caution, or as some would say, perhaps this is just a way of managing once again the public's expectations?
Sure, I think we could probably have arguments on both sides, but in many cases, I think the NPA and the DPCI are correct in saying, look, we've got to focus our energies here on this Zondo report. The sheer scale of the information is quite incredible. I think they were pointing out that there's 1 petabyte of information, which is 500 million megabytes of information. Their capacity to go through that and to make cases, as you say, to further investigate, to make very convincing cases is going to take a lot of work. So in many ways, I think tactically they're correct. They're going to try to concentrate their resources, put those in the task team. But as you say, we've heard this before. We've seen these task teams. We've seen these kinds of promises. And so we're quite skeptical in saying, well, is it going to be, the same thing over again? Well, let's see. We can probably, if we were betting people, we could say, well, it's a 50-50 chance that it's going to go really bad or not go anywhere. But I think in this case, we have to give the NPA and the DPCI the opportunity. If they fail, well, we're going to have to follow that path as well. And I think it's not going to be a very pretty one. But if they at least begin to do some of the job, and we see some prosecutions, I think that would begin to restore, even if not to 100%, at least it would begin to take us along a path that says, look, we're making some progress and we're beginning to see some results. And let's hope that that's the case. I think all of us are here to say we hope that that's the case, because I think none of us would like to see the other side of it, which is a complete failure and a complete repetition of what we've seen in the past. That would be disastrous.
And then just finally, Dr. McKinley, on something totally different. We've seen, of course, and you are a political analyst as well, the whole furore around that opinion piece that was penned by senior member of the ANC, Lindiwe Sisulu, and subsequent responses to it from a whole range of people, amongst them the minister in the presidency, Mondli Gungubele, saying that the government distances itself from that particular opinion piece. We've also seen ANC veteran Mavuso Msimang respond to this. And yesterday, of course, the acting Chief Justice calling a press briefing to address what he said was an attack against the judiciary. What's been your take on the developments around this?
Politics, politics, politics. I mean, I think, first of all, Lindiwe Sisulu is being quite a bit of an opportunist and a bit of a hypocrite, as you pointed out. She has been part of this administration, part of the ANC, very much part of all the things that she is criticizing with respect to the judiciary and the processes there. So she cannot remove herself all of a sudden and act like she's some outside critic that has not been part of this. I mean, that's just simply not factually correct, and it's certainly not politically acceptable. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that this is clearly an opening ambit in the larger political battle within the ANC for the upcoming ANC Congress and the elections for the presidents of the ANC and so forth. And we must see it as such. What we find out with many factions of the ANC is when things don't go their way, they're very critical. But of course, when the judiciary rules in their favor, they say we have a strong judiciary. So it's whether, it's basically you pick and choose when you want to make those criticisms. And I think Lindiwe Sisulu has picked a particular point. She's very smart to do so because it's going to hit a nerve with many people. And as you said, there's some legitimacy to that criticism. But overall, it's a political maneuver. It must be seen as such. And what the real issue is that we must reform and transform our judiciary as well as many other institutions, not because Lindiwe Sisulu thinks so, or that a faction of the ANC is going to be good for them, but because it's going to be good for our country and for better equality and justice. And I think that's what we must keep our eye on and not be distracted by many of these factional battles that are going on in the ANC.
So against that characterization and your analysis of the minister's opinion piece, what did you make of the Chief Justice, the acting Chief Justice, responding to that in the manner in which he did?
I think it was unnecessary. I think you're absolutely correct in the previous comments in saying that if we have a Chief Justice and should we say senior members of the judiciary who are always responding to criticism, he clearly, and I think many judges wouldn't like what Lindiwe Sisulu had to say. Too bad. It's okay. She has the right to say it. She might be taken to task for saying it. But I think the Chief Justice or the acting Chief Justice and others should just absorb that and say, look, we note these things and move on. If they give it more fuel, it's going to increase that fire. And I think it's going to bring unnecessary attention on their sort of very thin skins. If you're going to take those positions and make these kinds of rulings in a context of a divided and conflictual society, then you've got to take the hits along with it.
And thanks so much for your time, Dr. Dale McKinley. We have to leave it there. Appreciate it. Right to Know campaign founding member and political analyst Dr. Dale McKinley sharing his reflections on the statements issued by the Hawks and, of course, the NPA yesterday, in which the two law enforcement agencies are committing themselves to investigate and bring implicated perpetrators to criminal prosecution. And also just his views on our question of the day that we're asking you about Lindiwe Sisulu's opinion piece and the subsequent responses to it. It is 7 o'clock. Leanne standing by with your news.